So, recently, I found myself in the middle of a ridiculous showdown with a power-hungry HOA, a group of clipboard-wielding busybodies, and a couple of wannabe cops who thought they could intimidate me into following rules that don't even apply to me. At first it was just annoying letters, empty threats stuffed into my mailbox like junk mail. But when they actually sent fake law enforcement to my door, claiming they had the authority to arrest me, I knew things had gone way too far. Let's start from the beginning. The first red flag appeared in the form of an official-looking envelope with a fancy HOA logo on the front. That might not sound like a big deal, except for one minor detail. I don't belong to an HOA. Never signed anything, never agreed to any rules, never had a problem in the 20 years I've lived on this land. So why the hell was I getting a violation notice? I opened the letter and scanned the nonsense inside. Dear homeowner, as part of the HOA community, your property is subject to community standards and regulations. We have noticed the following violations that must be addressed immediately: unapproved fencing materials, failure to maintain HOA-approved landscaping, unauthorized vehicle parking in driveway. Please rectify these issues within 30 days to avoid fines and further action. I actually laughed out loud. Their rules? I follow my rules. This was my land, not some gated suburb where neighbors police each other's grass height. So I did what any rational person would do. I crumpled up the letter and tossed it in the trash. Problem solved, right? Wrong. 2 days later, 3 people in dress shirts and clipboards were standing at the edge of my driveway like missionaries about to deliver bad news. I stepped outside, coffee in one hand, shotgun leaning against the porch railing, and watched them like a hawk. The moment they saw me, the woman in front, a short blonde with an air of smug authority, cleared her throat. Good morning, sir. I'm Margaret Whitmore, president of the HOA. We're just here to do a quick property evaluation. I blinked. For what? Margaret smiled the way you do when explaining something to a toddler. Well, now that your property is officially within HOA boundaries, we need to ensure it meets community standards. I raised an eyebrow. Within HOA boundaries? Since when? She beamed. We voted last month to incorporate this section of the neighborhood into the HOA. It's really a great opportunity to... I held up a hand. Let me stop you right there. This isn't up for debate. My land isn't part of your HOA. I never signed anything. Her smile tightened. Well, unfortunately, the board has already decided. I let out a short laugh. Lady, you can't just vote to take someone's land. Her face twitched. One of the clipboard guys, a skinny, nervous-looking type who had probably never done a real day's work in his life, cleared his throat. Well, technically, the HOA has jurisdiction over all properties within the community boundary. I leaned in. And technically, you're all trespassing on private property. Margaret's expression darkened. I don't think you understand how this works, she said, crossing her arms. We have the authority to enforce community regulations. I pointed at my mailbox. See that address? Does it say HOA anywhere? Silence. I pointed at my gate. See that no trespassing sign? That applies to all of you. More silence. Margaret let out an exaggerated sigh, like I was the unreasonable one. Mr. Carter, we want to work with you, she said, forcing a smile. But if you refuse to comply, the HOA will take legal action. I grinned. Good. Can't wait to see how that works out for you. Her eye twitched. She turned to her clipboard crew. Let's go for now. They left, whispering among themselves, throwing glances back at me like I was some outlaw squatting on their land. I figured that was the end of it. I should have known better. The next morning, HOA violation notices were taped to my fence. 3 nights later, my security cameras caught them, sneaking onto my land. And that's when I knew it was time to teach these people a lesson. After I shut down their little property evaluation, I figured that was the end of it. They'd realize their mistake, back off, and move on. I was wrong. Instead of getting the message, they doubled down. Within a week, I started receiving dozens of HOA violation notices. At first, I laughed, because again, I'm not in their damn HOA, but these weren't just annoying little letters anymore. They were ridiculous. According to the HOA, I was now in violation of their community standards for having the wrong kind of fence, not submitting landscaping plans for my own backyard, unauthorized parking of my own damn truck in my own driveway. Now, if you're wondering how an HOA can find someone who isn't even a member, so was I. So I made a few phone calls. I reached out to the county property office, checked my deed, and confirmed, just as I thought. My land has never been part of their HOA. That should have been the end of it. But no, I called Margaret Whitmore, the HOA president, and politely informed her that they had zero authority over my land. And you know what? I could hear the smirk in her voice. Well, she said, voice dripping with fake concern, we've already documented your non-compliance. If you refuse to follow the rules, we'll have no choice but to escalate things legally. I raised an eyebrow. Legally? She let out a dramatic sigh. Mr. Carter, we don't want to be forced to take action, but this is about maintaining community order. I took a slow breath. Margaret, you can document whatever you want, but you don't have a single legal foot to stand on. Silence. Then, that smirk again. We'll see about that. And she hung up. Now, I'm not a paranoid man, but I know when someone's planning something. So, that night, I did what any rational person would do. I installed cameras. Good ones. Motion-activated, night vision, full security setup. And guess what? 3 nights later, my motion alert went off. I checked the feed, and there they were. HOA board members. Flashlights in hand, walking the edge of my property, measuring, marking things down, planning something. That's when I realized Margaret wasn't bluffing. She was about to make her move. They thought I was just some stubborn homeowner who would back down. They had no idea what was coming next. James was sitting on his porch, sipping his morning coffee when he saw them. 2 men, dressed in all black, badges clipped to their belts. The words, HOA Security Enforcement, printed on their vests. They walked up his driveway like they had actual authority here. One of them, a burly guy in sunglasses, stepped forward, clipboard in hand. James Carter? James didn't answer. He just took another slow sip of coffee, watching them. The second man, a wiry guy clutching a notepad, cleared his throat. Sir, you are in direct violation of HOA regulations and have repeatedly failed to comply with legal notices. We have been authorized to detain you until you agree to a compliance hearing. James set his mug down. Detain me? Burly guy nodded. Yes, sir. If you refuse to come with us, we'll have to escalate this to law enforcement. James stood up, stepping forward at a deliberate pace. All right, he said. Which department do you work for? The 2 men exchanged a glance. Wiry guy adjusted his notepad. We're contracted security under the HOA. James nodded. Right, so, not actual cops. Burly guy's jaw tightened. Sir, you are legally required to comply with HOA regulations. The association has authority over all properties within community boundaries, and failure to comply will result in... James held up a hand. Let me stop you right there. I'm not in your HOA. I never signed any agreement. My property is private land, and you two? You're trespassing. Wiry guy frowned. Sir, that's not how this works. James folded his arms. Number. That's exactly how it works. And Chai. They were about to find out why. If you two don't get off my land right now, I'll be happy to let the real police explain property laws to you. Burly guy smirked. Oh, We'll call them ourselves. James nodded. Great idea. He turned, walked inside, and grabbed his phone. By the time he stepped back out, the two officers were already shifting uncomfortably. James dialed the local sheriff's office, put the call on speaker, and spoke loud and clear. Yeah, I've got 2 men on my property impersonating law enforcement and threatening to detain me. I'd like an officer to come down and have a word with them. Burly Guy tensed. That's not necessary. Wiry Guy took a step back. Sir, we're just here to... James held up a hand. Yeah, they're wearing vests that say HOA Security Enforcement, but they don't seem to have any real authority. Might want to bring someone down here and straighten them out. The dispatcher confirmed a unit was on the way. James hung up. Burly Guy forced a chuckle. This is just a misunderstanding. James leaned against his porch railing. No, I think it's pretty clear. 15 minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser rolled up. A deputy stepped out, took one look at the 2 HOA goons, and shook his head. What the hell is this? James gestured toward them. These guys claim they're here to detain me for HOA violations. The deputy snorted. Is that right? Burly Guy straightened up. We're private security under HOA authority. The deputy folded his arms. That's funny because last I checked, the HOA isn't a government agency. You can't arrest people. Wiry Guy muttered, just compliance enforcement. The deputy raised a hand. No, what this is impersonating law enforcement. Do you realize that's a crime? Burly Guy swallowed. We were just following orders from the HOA board. The deputy nodded. Yeah, well, now you're following me downtown. Hands where I can see them. James watched as they were cuffed and read their rights, and right on cue, Margaret Whitmore pulled up. She barely had time to park before storming over, heels clicking against the pavement. This is outrageous, she snapped. They were just doing their jobs. The deputy sighed. Ma'am, their job just landed them charges for trespassing, harassment, and impersonating law enforcement. You want to join them? Margaret's mouth snapped shut. James took a step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. I told you to stay off my property. She glared at him, fury burning in her eyes. You think this is over? James smiled. Oh, I know it's not, because now I'm taking this to court. Margaret had just lost her fake cops. Next, she was going to lose something even bigger. Margaret cut in again, her voice laced with impatience. Deputy, if you would just listen... Harris turned to her, unimpressed. Ma'am, I have been listening, and all I'm hearing is a whole lot of excuses. Margaret's mouth snapped shut. Harris shifted his attention back to the 2 so-called security officers. Here's how this is going to go. You 2 are being charged with impersonating law enforcement, trespassing, and harassment. You'll be processed at the station. I'd suggest you start thinking real hard about who put you up to this. The burly guy's face turned pale. Wait! Margaret stepped forward, trying to regain control. Deputy, this is completely unnecessary. They didn't mean any harm. Harris shook his head. What's unnecessary is an HOA thinking it can enforce laws it doesn't have the authority to make. Margaret clenched her fists. This is harassment. Mr. Carter has been a menace to the community for months. He's the one breaking the law. Harris raised an eyebrow. Oh? That's so. Margaret crossed her arms, nodding firmly. He's threatened board members, refused to comply with regulations, and created a hostile environment in the neighborhood. Harris turned to me. Mr. Carter, you got anything to say about that? I smirked, pulling out my phone. Yeah, Deputy. I'd say you should take a look at this file labeled HOA Harassment, Full Security Footage. Margaret's face drained of color. I handed the phone over, and Harris hit play. The video showed everything, the board members sneaking onto my land in the dead of night, marking off areas for their so-called community improvement projects. And of course, the fake cops pounding on my door, claiming they had arrest powers. Harris watched in silence, his expression unreadable. When the video ended, he exhaled slowly and handed me back my phone. Then he turned to Margaret. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "I suggest you call a lawyer." Margaret sputtered. What? You can't be serious." Harris motioned to his deputy. "Cuff her." Margaret let out a shriek as she tried to back away, but the deputy grabbed her wrists and snapped the cuffs on. "You can't arrest me," she screamed. Harris shrugged. "You hired fake cops, sent them to harass a private citizen, and tried to enforce rules that don't exist. That sounds an awful lot like conspiracy to commit harassment." The burly guy and the wiry guy sat in stunned silence as the cruiser doors slammed shut behind them. The HOA had just lost its president and two of its most aggressive enforcers. I took a step closer, hands in my pockets. Margaret, her face red with rage, glared at me. "You think this is over?" she hissed. I smiled. "Nope." Then I leaned in slightly. "Because now, I'm taking this to court." Margaret's eyes widened. She knew this wasn't just about today. This was about dismantling the HOA's unchecked power for good. A week later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. A court summons. The HOA was suing me. Their official complaint accused me of being a public nuisance, a danger to community safety, and, this was the best part, demanded that my land be forcibly annexed into the HOA. I actually laughed. She was really trying to steal my property through the courts. Fine. If she wanted a legal battle, she was going to get one. I called up my lawyer, Rich, an absolute bulldog in land disputes. The moment he read through the complaint, he smirked. "This," he said, "is going to be fun." 2 weeks later, we walked into the courthouse. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table, looking smug, beside a lawyer who had the polished arrogance of someone charging $500 an hour just to exist. She didn't even look at me when I entered. She thought she'd already won. Then the judge walked in, a no-nonsense woman who looked like she'd seen every HOA scam under the sun. She barely glanced at the case file before letting out a tired sigh. "Let's get this over with." Margaret's lawyer rose to his feet. "Your Honor, the HOA has tirelessly worked to uphold the integrity of our community. However, Mr. Carter has repeatedly refused to comply with our regulations, causing disorder and distress among residents." Rich stood up, cutting him off. "Your Honor, let's start with the fact that my client's property isn't even part of the HOA." The judge frowned. "Wait, he's not in the HOA?" Margaret's lawyer hesitated. "Well, no, but nothing," Rich said smoothly, handing over a thick folder. "Here's a full history of the property, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was never under HOA jurisdiction." The judge flipped through the pages, her frown deepening. Then she turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, you do realize you cannot enforce HOA rules on a property that isn't within your HOA, correct?" Margaret shifted in her seat. "Your Honor, Mr. Carter has created a hostile environment." The judge held up a hand. "Let me stop you right there. This lawsuit is frivolous. You have no legal claim over his land, and given the footage submitted as evidence, you might want to start preparing your own legal defense because I see a counterclaim coming." Margaret's face paled. Rich smiled. "Oh, Your Honor, that's already in motion." The judge nodded. "Good. Case dismissed." She banged her gavel, and just like that, the HOA's lawsuit crumbled before it even started. Margaret sat frozen, her carefully planned attack completely dismantled. I leaned in as I walked past her. "Told you this wasn't over." She had lost her fake cops. Now she was about to lose something even bigger, her entire grip on the neighborhood. The judge arched an eyebrow. "Mr. Carter, do you live within the HOA?" Margaret straightened her back. "Well, Your Honor, his property falls within our expanded community boundaries." The judge turned to me. "Mr. Carter, do you have a response?" I slid a thick stack of documents across the table. Here's my property deed, proving my land has never been part of the HOA, and here's a certified county zoning map confirming my property is legally separate from their jurisdiction. Margaret's smile faltered. Her lawyer cleared his throat. That may be true, Your Honor, but the HOA board voted to expand its jurisdiction to include— The judge raised a hand, cutting him off. Let's be absolutely clear. A homeowners association cannot unilaterally seize private property. That is not how property law works. Margaret's face burned red. The judge turned back to me. Mr. Carter, do you have any counterclaims? I leaned forward. Actually, yes. I'd like to countersue for harassment, trespassing, and filing a frivolous lawsuit. Proceed, the judge said. I pulled out security footage, police reports, and sworn witness statements. The courtroom watched as video clips played. HOA board members sneaking onto my property in the dead of night, marking areas for unauthorized construction. Footage of Margaret's so-called officers pounding on my door, pretending to have arrest powers. A police report detailing how she hired unlicensed security to intimidate me. The judge exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. Then she turned to Margaret, her patience gone. Mrs. Whitmore, this is one of the most absurd cases I have ever seen. Margaret opened her mouth, but the judge silenced her with a look. The HOA has no legal authority over Mr. Carter's land. You cannot fine him. You cannot enforce rules on him, and you most certainly cannot deploy fake law enforcement to threaten him. Margaret's lawyer inched away as if regretting ever taking the case. The judge turned back to me. Mr. Carter, I am granting your counterclaim. The HOA is ordered to cover all legal fees and is fined $50,000 in damages. She slammed the gavel. Case dismissed. Margaret sat frozen in shock. Around the courtroom, HOA board members whispered among themselves, already plotting her removal. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and walked out. Margaret never looked my way. She knew she had lost. But I wasn't finished yet. Margaret thought losing in court was her worst nightmare. She was wrong. Because I wasn't just going to win, I was going to make sure the entire HOA felt the consequences for years to come. The very next morning, I paid a visit to the city planning office. With part of my $50,000 settlement, I made a rather strategic purchase. See, the HOA had always prided itself on its pristine, uniform aesthetics. Perfect sidewalks, manicured lawns, luxury amenities. They wanted their community to look like something out of a magazine. Well, now they were getting something new, a massive 12-foot billboard installed right at the entrance of their gated community. And what did it say? Attention, HOA. This land is not yours. Stay off it. Paid for by James Carter. Bold, all caps, impossible to ignore. To add a little flair, I even had their HOA logo printed in the corner, just to make sure there was no doubt about who the message was for. The fallout was immediate. My phone exploded with calls, emails, even a formal cease and desist letter from the HOA's lawyer. I forwarded it straight to the city, who promptly confirmed that my sign was 100% legal. Margaret lost it. She called for an emergency HOA meeting, desperate to find a way to take it down. But here's the kicker. After losing the lawsuit, covering my legal fees, and failing to annex my land, the HOA was broke. They simply couldn't afford to fight me anymore. And Margaret? She resigned in disgrace. Her empire crumbled overnight. A few months later, I spotted a moving truck in front of her house. She was leaving. For good. I sat back on my porch, coffee in hand, and watched her drive away one last time. My land, my rules.